Well, welcome everybody. This is going to be a great session. I'm David Kirkpatrick. I'm a journalist and I run a little company called Techonomy Media. We just had a great Techonomy conference in New York this week where we talk about this kind of stuff as well as a lot of other things about how technology is changing the world. We even published a magazine which I have here just to show you, and I also wanted to show off that we even have an article in it about training computer scientists in ethics, which is relevant to the topic. So essentially, if I would summarize what we're here to discuss, it's what is the risk that the technology that governs and determines modern society could itself become ungovernable, and how likely is it that AI will be the means by which we lose control of the tools that our lives depend on. And literally in the case of warfare, but also in the day-to-day sense. So we're going to be talking both about AI as an engine for weapons of killing, as well as the many ways that we already know that AI surrounds us, but with a focus on what could go wrong, and what should we do about the fact that there are so many things we can imagine that could go wrong. So in order to have that discussion, we have a quite excellent panel here, which was assembled by the ICT4Peace Foundation, which really gets the credit for this session and asked me to moderate it. They're based in Geneva and Zurich. Very, very, very good organization, which you should all know about, the ICT4Peace Foundation. So I'll quickly introduce the panelists. So what we're going to do is we've got a good amount of time, an hour and 15 minutes. So each of them are going to start with a no more than 8-minute presentation. Then we'll really have a discussion, which I am going to insist includes all of you. So please, we want to hear your questions, and not just questions, but comments, because I'm sure many of you are knowledgeable and expert on some of these matters. So it's a conversation that we want to have for the next hour and 15 minutes. Here to your left, my left, Kyle Dent is a researcher and AI developer at the Palo Alto Research Center. It's not called Xerox Park anymore.
No, just Park.
Xerox doesn't have anything to do with it anymore?
Xerox owns it.
Xerox owns it, but you play that down. Okay. Anyway, that's an eminent, very, where the idea for the Macintosh came from, basically. That's where Steve Jobs stole it, among other things. So Ron Deibert is, many of you probably know Ron, he's a local person, director of the Citizen Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs in the University of Toronto, who is real thoughtful about how technology needs to be governed and controlled. Todd Davies is Associate Director of the Symbolic Systems Program at Stanford University, and also what's the other group that you are?
The Center for the Study of Language and Information.
The Center for the Study of Language and Information, which actually predates the Symbolic Systems Program that emerged from it. The Symbolic Systems Program, which he is the Associate Director of, is where Marissa Mayer went, where Chris Cox, who's the #2 at Facebook, went, one of the co-founders of Instagram, you were saying, a ton of the most thoughtful and successful people in technology attended that program, because partly, I think, because it uniquely integrates computer science and some of the social sciences in a way that is that a fair summary? There are not enough programs that do that. Finally, Maarten van Horenbeeck, at the end, who is a veteran of a number of our most renowned technology companies, but he's not here to represent them, and we won't mention them, but he's done some heavy jobs for companies that you all use. He's a board member and former chairman of the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, which goes by the acronym FIRST, which is basically an organization of security experts and professionals, and he is our cybersecurity expert, which becomes very pertinent to this discussion. Now, I'm just trying to remember who was supposed to go first. Todd was supposed to go first. Do you want to go first? But we're not going to go first because we're not sure your video is going to work, or do we know if it's going to work or not?
Todd can't go first.
You can't go first. Is there still a chance it might work? Okay.
There's still a chance it might
Then why don't we just start with Kyle?
Okay.
take it away. Here's the mic.
Okay.
But you have to give it back to me.
Okay. I'll stay close. I should probably clarify Park's relationship with Xerox. So Park, until I think it was 2012 or so, was a captive research center within Xerox. And in 2012, Park was spun out as an independent subsidiary. So now we are Park, a Xerox company, no longer Xerox Park. Mostly, we just go by Park. So I lead two research groups there. One develops conversational agents, dialogue systems, so people talking with technology. And the other is an applied data sciences group. And I'm coming to this topic a little more recently than probably some of the others because of what I'm seeing in my work. And my interest is around the way I see it is the ethics of AI. So there's been a lot of press, a lot of attention to some of the way AI is being deployed today that is having harmful effects on people. And that's where my interest is. It's not in some future state, but things that we're doing already that are having bad effects on people's lives. So we see a lot of attention on like judicial sentencing and racial disparities there, or autonomous cars, and we've had a few fatal accidents now. And don't get me wrong, I think that we can actually save lives with a lot of the auto assist features that we have in cars now. Those are very helpful. And autonomous cars are probably, in the whole, going to save more lives. But at least in the first Tesla accident that happened in 2015, we've had a full investigation of that now. That was probably a preventable accident. And how that happened is some of the things that I think we need to look at. Overall, I think when we see AI systems deployed, there is a lack of transparency that goes along with it, because people don't necessarily understand what they do or how they're being used. And I think that we have both societal and technical reasons for why we're in the state we're in today. And my interest is in understanding those better so that we can make it a better situation. So people tend to abdicate responsibility when they have decision-making tools that will do the jobs for them. Mostly they don't understand the technology, and they certainly don't understand the limitations of the technology. On the deployment side, this lack of transparency is the biggest problem. So these jurisdictions that are using tools for sentencing are not able to discuss the algorithms that are being used in a way that people can have a public discussion about, was this fair or not? Then on the technology side, I think that AI researchers are not putting the attention into this that they should. I'll tell you a quick little story about one of the things that started to get my interest going in this. I was attending a presentation by one of the researchers at Park. I'll call him Bob, that's his name. He was describing a project that he was working on, and he was showing us a sample of the data that he had. And he was describing the data, and he said, unfortunately, there's a couple columns in here I can't use because it's not politically correct to use them. And that struck me as really the wrong way to think about it, because what he had was data that was biased in some way. But he referred to it as being politically incorrect, as if it would be offensive to people, and not that it was carrying forth biases related to gender or race or whatever it was. I don't remember what it was. But he really wasn't thinking about it in the right terms. And of course, he was frustrated because he knew that there was information in that data set that could improve his accuracy for that data set, but not for the real world, because there's not a causal relationship there. There was correlation in the data that he had, which would have produced good models for his purposes. But for this to be deployed in the world, it starts to fail in those ways that carry forward a bias that, by the way, as a society, we're trying to eliminate. But it's being perpetuated through data that's been collected over many years that's then being built into these models. So I think understanding all of these forces and overall trying to eliminate the lack of transparency that's been following the deployment of technology is critical to what we do now, because this is happening now. But as we go forward, and we're going to talk about some other future states where this is problematic.
Okay, why don't you pass it right on to Ron, because I think several of the things you said set him right up.
Yep. Hi everybody, welcome to Toronto. I'm Ron Deibert, the director of the Citizen Lab here at the University of Toronto. For those of you who don't know, the Citizen Lab does research on digital security issues that arise out of human rights concerns. So we don't focus on the entire cybersecurity landscape. It's very large, a lot of topics. Instead, we focus our research on issues that arise out of human rights concerns. So for many years, we've tracked internet censorship and surveillance worldwide, cyber espionage campaigns targeting civil society organizations. We're particularly interested in hidden privacy, security risks that might be contained in the applications that you all carry around with you in your phones. The secret sauce, if you will, of the Citizen Lab is our interdisciplinary approach. So I'm a political scientist, international relations person by background. But a lot of the people that work for me are not. They come from computer science, engineering science, law, area studies. A lot of our research starts with the technical research, the computer science and engineering science. We have been described as a kind of counter-espionage for civil society. I don't particularly like that term, but I understand why people describe it that way. And I think what they're getting at is we're not afraid to lift the lid on things that are going on beneath the surface involving very powerful actors, whether those powerful actors are states or companies. And that often puts us in the crosshairs. Our research can be uncomfortable for those groups. I don't study AI. I have an interest in the topic as an academic. I think there are some areas of our research that are bleeding into AI. What I'd want to emphasize in my remarks today concerns the broader issues around academic freedom and how it relates to understanding the rules generally, including artificial intelligence where that's applicable, but algorithms generally, software, code, etc., that plays a very important part in shaping our lives, in shaping our opportunities, in shaping the realm of the possible, in fact shaping our chances for expression and liberty as individuals. I think that there are serious risks to those who do the type of research that we do. And as AI becomes more important in structuring our lives, I think we need to make sure that we're protecting those methods, protecting the spaces for the type of controversial research that groups like us do. I'll give you a couple of examples from our recent experiences. So one of the research interests that we're involved in, as I said, is tracking internet censorship worldwide. And as a byproduct of that research, many years ago, we realized that some of the methods that we were using, network measurement methods and other technical interrogation methods, allowed us to essentially fingerprint the companies that were selling the internet censorship technologies to large internet service providers that were then being used at a national level to restrict access to information. Turns out that one of these companies is a Canadian company called NetSweeper. And so we've done many reports on NetSweeper's installations around the world. They happen to sell to some of the world's most notorious authoritarian regimes who use their technology to filter access to political information, human rights information, news information. For those of you who are interested, we just did a report about a month ago now, I think it was, called Planet NetSweeper, where we literally searched every single IP address on the internet to look for NetSweeper installations, reduced it down to 10 countries of interest, and we found that their technology was being used to, among other things, block access to LGBTQ information in a number of countries, to women's health information. NetSweeper says that they use an artificial intelligence backend to categorize content dynamically on the internet. Well, this particular AI doesn't work very well because one of the common characteristics of internet filtering technologies is they miscategorize information, and in particular women's health information, which often gets mistakenly categorized as pornography. A couple of years ago, we did a report on NetSweeper. and the use of their technology in Yemen. And prior to the publication of that report, like all of our reports, it's customary when it involves a company, we send a letter to them in advance. And we say, we're gonna publish a report, here are our main findings, here's an opportunity for you to respond to those findings. Not once have they replied to us. However, after the Yemen report was published, maybe a few weeks later, I woke up one morning and in my email inbox was a lawsuit for $3.5 million. That's a bit of a shock when you wake up in the morning, you look at it. Okay, so naming myself and the University of Toronto in a defamation suit. Obviously a legal process started. The University of Toronto hired outside counsel, and it went on for many, many months, and then without any notice, about 6 months later, they withdrew the lawsuit in its entirety. During that 6 months, we could not speak about the lawsuit. We could not do research on NetSweeper. Well, we could in the background, which we were, let me tell you, but we couldn't publish anything, is what I mean to say. So that's one instructive lesson. Second one is, again, another recent report of ours called Bad Traffic. It's about another Canadian company called Sandvine. It's a deep packet inspection technology company. No AI involved here. For this project, we did very similar techniques. We mapped the entire internet, and the research, by the way, was led by the remarkable Citizen Lab researcher Bill Marzak. So he had a signature he developed for Sandvine technology. And he scanned every single IP address, billions of IP addresses on the internet. We were able to discover where those installations were, but we wanted to refine the techniques to verify that we're making sure we're correct. So we went out and purchased a secondhand Sandvine device on eBay. And we set it up in the lab, turned it on, and kind of tested our signatures to make sure we had it right. Again, prior to publication of that report, we sent Sandvine a letter. And we said, here are our findings. We welcome you to respond. We'll publish your response in full. Well, their response was a very threatening, scary letter sent not back to me as the director of the Citizen Lab, but to the Chancellor of the University of Toronto, the President of the University of Toronto, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, the Director of the Monk School within which we're located, basically taking issue with the approach we were taking, disparaging our ethics, and most importantly, saying if we don't give that device back, you're gonna face serious legal action because you're misusing a license. This is not allowed. It's a violation of various laws and regulations and so on. Again, the University of Toronto hired outside counsel, and we delayed publication several times, ultimately went forward. The exchanges between legal counsel and this company are published in full alongside our report, which is called Bad Traffic. If you want to Google it, take a look at it. The last letter from outside counsel defending our research is a testament to academic freedom. And it made me very proud to be a professor, a tenured professor at the University of Toronto. The reason I bring these anecdotes up is because research of this sort, where you're effectively lifting the lid on what's going on beneath the surface and poking into areas where companies and maybe governments don't want you to look, is not undertaken without serious risk. And it shouldn't be taken for granted. I think we need to remind ourselves of that as not only AI, but technology in general surrounds us. So I'll leave with one last thought. I'm a big fan of the concept of hacking and hacktivism. I've been a proponent of it for many years. Unfortunately, the term has become almost entirely synonymous with criminal activity, except in some circles. I think we need to revive the concept and think about it as an approach to the protection of personal liberty writ large. We need to have everyone, not just technologists, but everyone in society as a whole think of themselves as hackers. At a time when we're surrounded by so much technology, perversely, special interests are placing limits, sometimes legal penalties and other obstacles in our way of understanding what goes on beneath the surface of that technology. And that is a recipe for authoritarianism. So I'll end it there and look forward to more.
Well, before you end it, one of the things I think you believe in, you should just say now, you think that as AI becomes more integrated into our daily lives and the systems that surround us, the challenge of transparency, which Kyle spoke about, is going to become even greater, right? Just quickly address that.
Well, I think that to the extent that most of the operators of the algorithms and artificial intelligence technologies that will be governing what we do are in the hands of the private sector, we're talking about very wealthy, deep-pocketed companies that can use their resources to target and silence the type of research that might be critical of what they're doing, or might be working in the interests of greater transparency. The academic centers are not the only places where this is done, but I think it's essential that the university, the way that the University of Toronto stood up for us, I think is not something every university in the world will do. And I think the universities, as a general concept, need to remind themselves that they are the custodians of knowledge and public interest research. And this type of research is not to be taken for granted. It needs special protection.
Great. Yeah, please do.
Yeah, just to add on that this lack of transparency is not just coming from the fact that there are corporate bad actors that are protecting their own self-interest. It's researchers are developing models and algorithms where they're making decisions about what should go into those. So they're deciding what data set should I use to train my models, what attributes of that data are relevant to this problem that I want to solve, what trade-offs am I making in the algorithms between capturing more information and making more mistakes, or less information but having more mistakes, the other way around. Less information, more mistakes, more information, less mistakes. All kinds of decisions, and each one of these is a possible value judgment. And not only are these not being communicated, they're not even being documented for the most part. These are decisions individuals are making, it's never captured. So it never makes it out to the stakeholders to have a conversation about it.
Okay, great. Are we able to take Todd now?
I think so.
Okay, let's give it a shot. So-
Almost 3,000 precision strikes last year. We're super proud of it. It allows you to separate the bad guys from the good. It's a big deal. But we have something much bigger, of shaped explosive. This is how it works. Did you see that? That little bang is enough to penetrate.
So that video is called the Slaughterbots video. It was made last fall, funded by Elon Musk, I think, and done at the direction of Stuart Russell, professor of computer science at Berkeley. He's a longtime friend of mine, and who kind of recruited me into this cause, which is now under the general heading of the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, international level. So, yeah, my name is Todd Davies. I'm at Stanford, and I should mention that presentation there was a dramatization. That wasn't the real CEO, and that particular product is not for sale. But it could be. I mean, we could imagine it. The technology is in place to make autonomous weapons of that size and of that devastating capability. And all the issues surrounding that are what I want to talk about here. My own background is I started out as an AI researcher in the 1980s and early 90s, and then decided that, and I was interested particularly in uses of AI for improving humanity, for improving legal systems, making the world more just. And I concluded after a while that it would be more interesting for me and maybe more needed to study people and the human side of this. So I went into psychology and social science, and I'm now focused on the social science of digital technologies. I teach courses in that and do research on it, and mostly on the positive aspects, things like using technology tools for democratic deliberation and decision-making, for exploring ways that they can expand people's rights and freedoms, and tools for making governments more responsive. But I've been recruited into this campaign, and I think it helps us to focus by looking at this really dire possible scenario on what's at stake for governance and for the decisions we all have to make as humanity about what we want to allow in the future, particularly in the domain of war and conflict. That video is available on a website called autonomousweapons.org that you can visit, and it's the site for the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which is a joint initiative of all the main, or most of the main, human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, our partners. The campaign itself was initiated by the Future of Life Institute under the direction of Max Tegmark at MIT, and working with Stuart and others in the AI community. Put out an open letter in 2015 from AI researchers, several thousand AI researchers and lots of interested others. And big name scientists like Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, technologists like Elon Musk are behind this campaign. So I'd urge you to look at that website. The first question people often ask me about this is, what is an autonomous weapon? There is a working definition in the UN that's been an overlay on the discussions that have happened mostly in Geneva last fall at the meeting of countries that are signatories to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. This is an annual meeting, and there was an attempt by Stuart and others to get them to adopt a resolution in November. They decided not to do that, but to continue it, and there'll be another meeting in November. But I think there's urgency around this because the technologies for the kind of thing that is depicted in that video and other autonomous weapons are already available and in place, and it's really just a matter of systems engineering to turn them into real capabilities on a large scale. So a few things about lethal autonomous weapon systems. The acronym for that is LAWS, L-A-W-S. Might be a misnomer because it seems like they could put an end to laws in a way. But they are, as you could see from the video, potentially very small. An individual weapon could fit in the hand of a child, could actually be operated by a child. But they can be produced at massive scale. And when produced at large scale, they become weapons of mass destruction. Essentially could be used to kill thousands, maybe even millions of people. One of the things that's different about autonomous weapons from previous weapon systems is that they really decouple to an unprecedented extent the number of weapons that can be used from the number of people that are required to deploy them. So a small number, handful of people could unleash autonomous weapons onto the world. They can travel anywhere in the world in large numbers and swarms, target people for all kinds of reasons on the basis of all kinds of characteristics. And there's no practical defense against them that the people like Stuart that I've talked to know about, except perhaps for electromagnetic pulse, EMP, which is generally disabling. So that's another reason why they're so scary, is because the inability to defend against them. With the video, you can see how everyone should feel threatened by such a weapon, because it could, I mean, we know that technology like that could even make its way into our houses, could find us and autonomously kill us. if it were allowed to do so.
And Todd, just to clarify, that's one of the central features of this technology, is that it is capable of making a decision to strike on its own.
Yeah, right, it can make that decision. It can also do that at the behest of somebody with ill intent. And it doesn't have to be a state.
But it can also be program parameters without an individual decision being made by a human.
Yes, and of course, there are discussions in relation to strong AI and the singularity about just how independent that thinking could get, whether the weapons could turn on us because they decide that we're threats to the environment or whatever. I mean, so there are all kinds of potential scenarios, but I think that general definition that I gave is pretty good, that these weapons are ones that locate, select, and eliminate human targets without human intervention. Did I mention that? That's the UN definition. There are systems in existence that more or less meet that, like landmines, for example, very simple form of technology by comparison that locate and select their targets just by the person that happens to step on them. But there's no human that decides what to do at that point. It's the weapon that kills the person. So they're very destabilizing, and they're also relatively cheap. I mean, you could have kits that could allow people to make these on their own, but even at an industrial scale, this is more like chemical and biological weapons in being, sort of the poor nation's alternative to nuclear weapons that we've heard about in relation to those weapons. So they're ideally suited to dictators, terrorists, bad people, large states that don't define themselves as dictatorships or terrorists, but sometimes operate that way. They are also, because they are software based on software technology, they're vulnerable to hacking. They're vulnerable to accidental use. Scenarios like a kind of military flash crash that we could imagine. The idea of taking humans out of the loop at key points of decision making is scary because we have data from history that shows that it was only human decision making that saved us, like the case of Stanislav Petrov, who died about a year ago, who may have saved us all from a nuclear war by deciding to ignore the early warning system in the Soviet Union in 1980s. The decision by the Soviets, by I think one vote, not to launch a nuclear attack against the US during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the idea of ceding that control to machines is very scary. I'm also a former president of Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, for which launch on warning and eliminating human control of the decision to launch was its founding issue. How are we doing on time?
Pretty close to wrapping up.
Okay, so there are many other things that we could talk about, questions that people tend to have, but I think the bottom line is that the campaign argues that a treaty banning these weapons is in the best interests of all of our individual countries. It's in the best interests of even the United States, the most powerful military country, and of humanity itself. And if anyone disagrees with that, I encourage you to come forward with your arguments, because we've thought about these things and I'm ready to answer. I also should say that I'm speaking only as an individual here and not on behalf of the campaign.
Okay, pass it to Maarten. Thank you so much, Todd.
Thank you. So my name is Maarten van Horenbeeck, and I'm with an organization called the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams. And what makes us special is that many people think of our members as being the fire brigades of the internet. Because the way that our members work, and our members are about 400 security teams in over 85 countries today, the way that we work is that when something breaks and when something goes horribly wrong with security, one of our members gets called in, steps in, solves the issue for their network, and then in good cases communicates with the rest of the world on what they did and how they did it. So we're really a platform where security teams can share and exchange information on incidents that they've dealt with. Now what's really interesting is that as someone who has worked in security for about 18 years now, When I talk to my peers about artificial intelligence and I ask them whether it plays a role in their day-to-day life, quite often the answer I will get is that it's minimal. And it may sound a little bit different to many of you that may talk to security vendors who like to talk a lot about artificial intelligence, but the day-to-day impact of the technologies hasn't been very visible. But that's a bit of a misnomer, because in fact, artificial intelligence, machine learning have been at the root of a lot of core security technologies that have been used over 10, 20 years. Many of you may remember that in the early 2000s, a lot of us thought that email was going to come to an end because we got so much spam that we didn't know what to do with our mailboxes anymore. Today, that problem is mostly solved because of things like Bayesian machine learning, algorithms that help identify which message is spam and which one is not. So within security, artificial intelligence has played a really big role, even though we're not always equally cognizant of it. What has also become really interesting to us is the amount of attacks on artificial intelligence that actually make sense. Sometimes artificial intelligence or machine learning breaks because it just wasn't really well designed to deal with a particular problem. We see that sometimes with malware detection. In other cases, hackers can actually use technologies or techniques that we term adversarial machine learning, where they actually try to trip up machine learning mechanisms to make them believe that something that is in fact malicious is in fact clean. There are techniques like genetic programming that can be used to bypass classifiers as just one machine learning mechanism. So we've seen a little bit of the good and we've seen a little bit of the bad. In recent years, there have been some really interesting projects that have shown how machine learning and artificial intelligence are actually going to play a bigger and bigger role in security. We all know that with the amount of security issues and as they increase, staying up to date as human beings is becoming very, very difficult. Like, security engineers try to develop systems that don't break, but in reality they do. And so we need to have mechanisms to identify when those breaks do take place. And just a few years ago in 2016, there was an interesting project funded in the US by DARPA, which was called the Cyber Grand Challenge. And the Cyber Grand Challenge was a novel idea where teams from across the world would come together, write essentially code that would try to attack other systems, identify vulnerabilities in their code, and exploit them, and also identify vulnerabilities in their own code and automatically patch them. So it was really machine against machine in a capture the flag competition, as we all know from the security world. It was a really, really interesting project. When you look at the outcome, even the most advanced machine was still a little bit behind on what security engineers and security teams can do. But we're definitely going in a direction where artificial intelligence is going to have to play a bigger role in protecting systems. The interesting thing about this is that in cybersecurity, really the impact of artificial intelligence breaking isn't that bad. Yes, we may misqualify one email, we may miscategorize a malware sample, but in the end, that's why in security we build things in layers and we have multiple ways of dealing with problems. In real life applications of artificial intelligence, that isn't always the case. When you think of high frequency trading algorithms, in algorithm tripping up, such as what happened on the New York Stock Exchange in 2010, can cause massive losses. When you think of autonomous lethal weapons, it becomes even higher impact, because suddenly there's impact on individuals' lives and potentially their dignity, which is also in many ways a human right. So that's something that to me as a cybersecurity professional is really concerning, because much of how we deal with security incidents actually is based on trial and error. We see something failing, we respond as security incident responders, and we do an analysis of what happened. And this is in many ways similar to how, for instance, in the US, the National Transportation Safety Board works with airplane accidents. When an accident happens, they do a post-mortem, they investigate, and they come up with a set of recommendations, and everyone learns. And as a result, airplanes have become a lot more safe. With cybersecurity and the security of these new artificial intelligence tools, that's a lesson that's going to become very difficult, because as we start looking at algorithms like, for instance, deep learning, the connection between the source data, the algorithm, and the output will become much less transparent. And in many cases, it won't be possible anymore to look at the outcome of a decision and then determine where actually that decision was made. because it happens somewhere in the deep learning algorithm, and it's no longer predictable because it's based on a ton of learning that went into the algorithm ahead of time. So that's a really interesting outcome, and it actually breaks, in many ways, the model of having the ability to respond effectively. And
Does
so
that mean response becomes potentially impossible?
I would say, taken to its extreme, response may be very difficult. There will always be an opportunity to decommission an algorithm and take it out of service and replace it, and that would still be a viable response. But actually identifying what caused the error will become more and more challenging over time. And so what you see with weapons is that one of the safeguards that are being put in place is actually creating this distinction between the human that actually makes the decision on can a particular individual be attacked and what the algorithm can do. So the algorithm can do a lot, but in the end there needs to be a human decision. And I hear also from the government group of experts that there's quite a bit of discussion around putting controls like that in place. And I think that's something really important to think about, because when you look at airline safety again, in the 90s and the 80s, there were actually quite a few safety-related incidents that were caused by human error. And what was identified was that there was actually a lot of this that was related to the humans not dealing very well with the increased automation in the cockpit. And one of the videos that I actually tell all of my security teams that I've managed to watch is a beautiful video that's available from YouTube. It's called Children of the Magenta. And it's a pilot for a major US airline that trains individuals on human error. And one of the things he talks about is that when something happens in the cockpit which is abnormal, that the first thing the pilot should do isn't to try and fix it in the machine. It is to turn off the autopilot and fly the plane. And I'll leave you with the thought that one of my major concerns with artificial intelligence is that as we build more and more of these complex algorithms and we disconnect them from human decision making, we may end up in a place where turning off the machine and going back to doing it manually is no longer going to be possible. So we need to start thinking about the impacts of that and make sure that we have safeguards in place before it really truly becomes a problem, rather than after we're dealing with the consequences.
Okay, that's fascinating, but give one quick example of where that might occur. Situation.
So the best example I can really think of is these weapon systems. So when you have a weapon system, and the weapon system uses inputs from various sources to make a decision on whether or not to perform an attack. Those inputs can be manipulated. So an attacker or an adversary that has the ability to generate inputs that go into the algorithm, or even worse, manages to obtain the training data that the algorithm is based on, can actually lead to completely unpredictable outcomes of those systems. And so unless we find absolutely foolproof ways of safeguarding the quality of that input and safeguarding the quality of that learning, which I think we are very far away from today, if we don't build in a safeguard that actually makes the decision on whether or not to engage a human decision, we'll end up with situations where, in this case, lives may be lost and we don't have the ability to trace back what actually caused the mistake.
But also you're saying we might not be able to turn it off, even though it had been essentially taken over by a zombie, it become a zombie of some sort in effect.
Given to what degree software can be manipulated and backdoored, I could see possible outcomes where it may be very difficult to stop a process, but those are actually things you can safeguard against.
Okay, good. Well, this is, there's so many issues that have already been put on the table, as you may have noticed. I mean, so here we have a very untransparent kind of technology that's evolving at an incredibly rapid pace, where increasingly we have the risk of not putting people in the loop, as the term that's used, in deciding when the software ought to make a key decision, and it has the prospect of actually getting out of our control, even to the point that we might not be able to turn it off. I mean, that's very HAL-like, really, I guess, going back to the classic case of 2001 computer taking over, which is scary. So, but I wanted to come back to Kyle quickly, because one of the things you talked about in our preparation was this idea that engineers need to think differently. Yeah, that would be good if you could, so I can keep control over here. Talk about what you think about how engineers' role needs to shift.
Right, so my story of Bob is a good example. So engineers are by far most interested in the technology they're working on. And they're not even necessarily thinking about what the application of that technology will be. Sure, they have in mind, yes, this is to solve some problem, but the problem that's particularly interesting is the technical aspects of it or the math that's behind it. If you go to technical conferences, that's all it is. It's a lot of talk about math or matrix and all kinds of information related to that and very little related to the application of any technology. And I think that engineers need to be thinking more about if the technology I'm working on is going to either interact with human beings or it will have an impact on people's lives, then there has to be some upfront consideration while they're developing the technology.
Okay, that's a good way of putting it, but you made another point also as we were talking before, which was that if the solution in many cases to how to put a brake on the potential negative effects of AI is to have a phase of the decision making where people should be brought into the process, engineers by their nature, by their personality and their training and their interests, are not likely to come to that on their own, because they're going to want to keep finding a computer solution to the problem. That's
very true.
Yeah.
Right, having that technology focus all the time means you're always thinking about what can I do technically to make this work? And you think in terms of, well, human input is expensive, either in complicating it or actual cost. So it's always minimized. The idea is always to minimize that. Technologists think automation first and not necessarily augmentation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I do think one thing that I also picked up in prepping for this, many times when you look at the real issue that AI is putting before society, we need to find a break point where the person is brought back in, or else we experience tremendously increased risks. Go, Matt.
So I just want to make an important, I think, subtle point. We've been talking so far about AI out of human control or beyond human control, which I do think is very important. But we shouldn't forget AI as a tool of human control. A couple uncomfortable truths that I'd like to lay out there right now. One, may be obvious to everyone in this room, I'm sure, but it's worth highlighting, that we live in an economy that is a personal data surveillance economy. In spite of what the companies out there say about wiring the world and connecting social networks and connecting friends with each other, these companies are about harvesting, mining, analyzing as much data as they can about us, and then selling it back to us through targeted advertisement. Machine learning, artificial intelligence is increasingly an important component of that. I think right now there's a very interesting experiment going on in China. And of course, China is investing a lot in artificial intelligence, but in that context, it's being used as a tool of social control. There are some really frightening prospects on the horizon of the ways in which personal data surveillance economy is being repurposed in China as a tool of government control, categorizing people in different ways using the very same algorithms and economic models, but instead to classify people in terms of social and political risk. This to me highlights a very important point that I think we're all kind of scratching at the surface of, whether it's about AI out of control or AI as a tool of control, is that technological change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a political and social context. And that context is critical. In order to do the types of checks and balances and restraints that Todd and Maarten are talking about with respect to lethal autonomous weapons, requires a certain type of political context where you have the possibility for independent verification, division of power, and so forth. When I look globally right now and see the resurgence of authoritarianism and the success of that model in China, frankly, I'm really concerned about the future and the prospects for those type of controls.
The combination in China of an inclination toward authoritarianism and extreme technological competence is quite scary. But one of the things I want to turn to before we go to the audience, because believe it or not, we're actually going through our time very quickly, is what do we do about it? Okay, so on two two categories I'd like somebody here to address before we go to the audience, or maybe multiple people. One is, how our policymakers currently think or don't think about this, and what we would like to see from policymakers generally. And two, this question which we've discussed in preparing a little bit, what kind of global response potentially might be called for? Anybody want to grab either of those? It's sort of a Todd question for one thing, huh?
Yeah, so, well, an international agreement to ban autonomous weapons is one of the policies that we want to see. Last week I spoke about this at Stanford Law School, and I immediately got asked, would that actually have any effect? Is it enforceable? But we do have the examples of the chemical and biological weapons conventions, which have been effective in most places most of the time. Yes, there have been violations in Syria and elsewhere, particularly in that part of the world, but nations are defining themselves as outside of the international system when they do that, with sometimes excessive and unjustified consequences, but nonetheless it reflects the power of the convention. I want to mention something just to acknowledge before we go to questions, and I'll get back to your control in a minute, but this was not originally supposed to be so high in testosterone and Y chromosomes compared to the rest of humanity.
Yes, we were supposed to have one woman.
We were supposed to have one, and it was going to be Sita Pena-Gangadaran, who's a former senator with me. And I can't channel her or speak for her, but one thing that I feel she would want to talk about is the effects of AI and machine learning and reinforcing and just training human biases, and the effects of machine learning algorithms in perpetuating racism, sexism, just by learning from training data that's what the people who happen to be using the technology already fostered. So, and there are lots of good sources on that. Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, is a great one. Frank Pasquale's book, The Black Box Society. And I think this is very much also part of the discussion that we should be having here.
Good. Let me just quickly summarize two things, and I really want to hear audience thoughts and questions. But we talked in preparation not only about the quite urgent need for some sort of global agreement on, autonomous weaponry, because that is real and it's a global need and it's urgent. But there are so many other urgent needs for global agreement and discussion about digital society. For example, the ungovernability of a small number of global companies that are more powerful than companies, and countries don't even understand. So there's a whole realm of issues that really need to be discussed at a global level, and I just want to put myself at least on the record as saying this is an urgent need for a global conference, a Geneva Convention of some sort around cyberspace for a whole number of reasons. I'm sure it's coming up in a lot of sessions at this conference. But the other thing, just to say the obvious, that nobody here needs to say, except just to quickly say it, policymakers are completely ignorant in really every country except China. And a little bit in the EU on privacy, they've done good work, but when it comes to the nature of AI and where we're headed, we just don't have governments almost anywhere, again, except China, that really do see where we're headed, and that is extremely scary. So I just want to say that. So who has, unless there's quick thoughts of any of you guys, let's go to the audience. Who's got, okay, do we have mics for people, or how do we do that? Just shout it out, maybe?
Shout out.
Yeah.
If you can't hear me, let me know. If you're gonna do something.
Yeah, please identify yourself.
My name is Maarten McCarthy with
Oh,
Georgetown.
okay, we're gonna take you on, but don't let the mic make you talk longer.
God gave me a small voice, thank God that there are.
Todd, say who you are.
Mark McCarthy with Georgetown and
Thank you.
SIIA.
Good.
If we're going to have an international instrument, one is to say let's ban the stuff, but another approach that people have suggested is to say don't deploy, and everybody agrees to this, don't deploy until the technology is good enough to observe the laws of war at least as well as a reasonable human commander. So that means being able to discriminate between civilians and military and making the right judgment on proportionality and the use of force. Those are tough decisions to make by people, but if machines can make them just as well as people, why wouldn't we be able to go forward? But not until that point.
That was a very informed thing. I call that a comment, not a question. So did I see another hand somewhere? Okay.
Hi, my name is Micaela Mantegna from the University of San Andres in Buenos Aires. And my question is about this bringing the human into the process that you said is kind of not a solution because it's not scalable. And you were talking about deep neural networks and the obscurity and the incapability of these systems to give a rationale of their decision. Do you believe that there is technically feasible to achieve that through explainable AI? And do we have to invest in explainable AI developments?
Thank you. That's a key phrase that we were supposed to use. Somebody want to comment on that?
I'd just comment that DARPA, the Defense Research Funding Organization, does have a program for explainable AI. So there are several people starting to get involved in that. It's not clear that that's enough, but it is another approach that people are taking to try to understand the technology better.
But in reality, it isn't that explainable, right? I mean, even the paper that ICT4Peace produced that was sort of a basis for this panel has like a paragraph of, maybe several paragraphs of definition, and there's all kinds of sub-definitions, and there's at least 4 major categories of AI. I mean, it does help explain why our policymakers are so ignorant. It's not that easy to understand, right?
Well, the deep nets, neural networks right now, they are completely opaque. Nobody understands them. The developers don't understand the correlations or the weights that those things are learning are unknown.
Oh, very explainable. Okay, real quick.
Yes, my name is Julius from the Deutsche Welle Academy in Germany. Does anybody of you see the connection between biogenetics and AI? And if yes, what does it mean?
Well, great point. Any quick thoughts on that? Maybe it's just a thing to put on the table that you successfully did. Who has some? How about? Okay, do I see you've got a hand up? Is that a hand? That's all right.
Hi, I'm Dent from the internet. To what extent is explainable AI, considering that so much of human motivation and psychology is predicated on forming sort of post hoc justifications for the decisions that we've already made, to what extent is explainable AI kind of a wild goose chase in that regard?
We have only one AI scientist on the panel, so poor Kyle.
So it depends what you expect from explainable AI. If you expect, let's say we arrive at some solution and we say, we now have explainable AI. If you expect that you could sit down with this thing and have a conversation like you would a friend and talk through something, that's not going to happen. But if you want to say, given this, 15-layer neural network that is telling me I should do this, what is that based on? We'll probably get there. And then maybe we have that conversation between you and your friend where you make some value judgments about whether that's the right thing or not.
Steve's also with LaborNet in San Francisco. One of the issues I think for AI is the future of working people. There's a topic of panel on that. But I mean, the driving force for a lot of capitalists is to use AI to eliminate labor. And this is, Musk is having a problem with that at his factory. He brought on too many robots, thought he was going to automate and use AI. What is the cost, the social cost, and how is that going to be resolved? Because this development, AI can have a major social effect on massive working people.
That's a super good point, but I'm going to ask us not to pursue it because that is discussed in so many other panels. This is discussed very seldom. This issue of what AI is going to do to jobs, I mean, it is a huge issue. It is being addressed ad infinitum, and I frankly think very inchoately, but forgive me for saying that because this issue of AI going out of control and not taking jobs is a whole different ball of wax.
Hi, my name's Agnes. I'm from the University of Ottawa. With regards to international agreements, they're states, but a lot of this stuff is going on amongst corporations, and so how do you reconcile that when you're thinking of international agreements?
So I think this is a broader issue. We were talking at lunch before this about if we were to have a global summit to deal with these kinds of issues and others in digital technologies, how would we design it so that it wouldn't just be the big powerful actors already exerting their control over that process. And I think we're in agreement that we want the companies there to listen. How much they have a voice and a vote, I think, is much more of a question, especially when they don't have the kind of democratic legitimacy that elected governments have. And I don't have the answer, but I mean, we already know that if democratic processes don't take control of this, then the corporations will. And the video is meant to make people realize how easily that could happen.
On the other hand, if Mark Zuckerberg can simply refuse to appear before Parliament, even though he may be threatened with not being arrested if he ever set foot in the UK, it goes to show these companies are not paying a lot of attention to law. Okay, here.
Hi, the Juan from the internet as well. My question is, why are we placing the onus on companies versus governments and institutions to make these kinds of laws or policies? Do you think it should be in the hands of corporations? Do you think it should be in the hands of government? What institutions should we look to enforce such laws or policies?
Do you think it should be in the hand of government?
I believe so, yes. But I'm asking you if there's any reason to believe corporations should be responsible for enforcing laws around this.
Thank you. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd love to take that one. So it's a really, really good comment, and I actually think we need to think wider than just governments or corporations. I actually think one of the benefits that we have with technology is that we can actually enforce various types of requirements and things in code. And there is no reason why government should be the only ones that have input on that. There's no reason companies should be the only ones. I think multi-stakeholder discussions where we actually bring in citizens, where we bring in governments and enterprise to talk through these issues and actually identify the challenges is going to be really important. And with that, I want to jump really quickly to the very first question, which to me is a bit related, which was around whether the technology will ever be good enough that we can trust them to adhere to the rules of law. The thing is, today we train soldiers and we get soldiers up to speed on what they need to do. If multiple soldiers mobilize, then it's either an action by the government or it's a mutiny. With these types of technologies, we're moving to a level where one individual can control a wide set of systems if they manage to compromise any of the inputs to the learning algorithm or the systems themselves. So I think it's a good thing to aim towards. It's quite unlikely we'll get there in a reasonable time.
Okay. Yeah, this guy really wants to. I will get to you in a minute because I want to hear. Go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Fredrik Stromberg. I'm also from the internet, I guess.
That's not really.
Okay, fair enough. I run a VPN service, but that's not relevant to this panel. That's what I meant. Sorry. Okay, so my question relates to specifically autonomous weapons, and my question is from well, you're talking about policies and how can we make sure that this doesn't happen, and from a incentives game theory perspective, it doesn't look very encouraging because if you tell all states that please don't make autonomous weapons like in the video, everyone's going to say, sure, I won't make autonomous weapons, and then they will still do it. When it comes to nuclear disarmament, there are plenty of tests that we can do to detect weapons tests from way far away. But building these things is within the capabilities of an individual with no nuclear reactor. So how, from a game theory perspective, how do you expect to enforce everyone saying, we won't make autonomous weapons, and then they make them anyway?
Ron, how about quick Todd, but I think Ron should say something about this.
Sure. So I'm glad that you brought that up. This question came up last week at Stanford Law School. Someone asked, well, what about the prisoner's dilemma in relation to this situation? And I pointed out, this is what you're saying, there's a solution to social dilemmas of that kind, which is an agreement that gets us out of that bad cell where everyone is defecting. And that is, it has to be an enforceable agreement. So that's what you're pointing out. How do we do that? The treaty idea, I think, would be aimed at stopping mass production distribution, sales, across international borders, and use. And it would distinguish between capabilities and technologies. So we recognize most of the technologies, if not all, are in place for the kinds of things that we're talking about. It's really the embodied sets of those that create capabilities that we're talking about. We can apply that through legal definitions to do everything that governments do. You can punish people for using, producing, distributing, possessing them. We can isolate nations that violate an international agreement, just like we do with biological and chemical weapons. I think that's a pretty good analogy. So we'll recognize it's not going to work all the time. Someone asked me last week, well, you know, how can we enforce it when we know there are places where it's not going to be enforceable? But you know, we don't not have laws against murder just because there are lots of murders, particularly in the U.S.
I could just add to that. I think that, you know, when we talk about arms control in general, in this area in particular, you have to think about a web of constraints. And there'll be a variety of practices that will be part of a verification regime. Talk about, you know, banning mass production and how to verify that. That will be one component. I just want to reiterate a point that I made at the very beginning as it applies to both this and what Maarten said earlier, and to this area as a whole. Whether we're talking about lethal autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, or just algorithms in general, one part of this web of constraints has to be a safe space for researchers to open up the black box of what's going on, to engage in adversarial machine learning, to do reverse engineering. The fact that most of this technology is in the hands of the private sector and will be into the future creates a very serious legal risk for that type of research. Right now, protections for that type of research are rare and tenuous. And I think, as my example showed at the outset, there are ways that companies with deep pockets can prevent people from doing this type of research. So as we think about arms control writ large, we need to understand the value of research as one part of that web of constraints.
Thank you. Okay, here.
Hi, I'm Miranda from Upturn. Where there are advanced AI systems that governments are interested in using for law enforcement, for instance, or things that large parts of society would have a problem with, but wouldn't rise to the level of an international ban because people might see some utility in them, like predictive policing or facial recognition, enhanced body-worn cameras. Do you see any role, or what role, I think, do you see for engineers to kind of exert the ethical frame to say, like, we actually don't believe this should be built, and if you are my employer intend to build it, we're going to leave as Google engineers. A few of them did in the past couple of days. Do you think that that is effective, or do you think that if the market is demanding it, that technology will be built, and perhaps by people who would build it more badly than the people who would have the wherewithal to get up and leave?
That's a very good question. Anybody have thoughts on that? Do you have a thought on that? Is that why you put your hand up? No. You do? Okay, really fast.
No, it was exactly about this categorization. Kyle said that engineers are not looking at it from the right perspective, and I would say that's the rule, but with very promising exceptions. There's a work recently called the moral character of cryptographic work, which is very important on a related area. And if on what she said, if you listen to Yembekun, if you listen to Yosha Benju, if you listen to a lot of important AI researchers, they're clear in categorizing. While you're working with natural language processing, fine. Preemptive policing, no, it's not mature enough. So how do you, that was my question, how do you prevent, or how do you set industry standards to say, yes, this technology is mature enough to develop, this other one is not?
I think that's right in line, that we have to get this brought into the culture of AI, development, artificial intelligence, that doctors and lawyers have these codes of ethics, and that idea of do no harm came from the fact that they're acknowledging, I'm in a position where I can do harm, and AI researchers need to recognize that also, that they're in the same point now, where they are doing things that can commit harm in the society, and they need to stop and say, I'm not going to do things that will create harm.
Also, and Maarten, I think you were talking about this at lunch, the idea of an arms race can be applied here too, that there could be potential opportunities for innovation on the individual side in this arena that we might not have even thought of yet, whether it's I mean, I don't know, if facial recognition is identifying everyone who walks down the street in China, maybe somebody will find a way to make your face seem obscured to a computer camera. I don't know. But those sorts of things are clearly attractive to innovation right now, so there may be a lot of opportunity as these surveillance and interference technologies become more pervasive. There is still a market of consumers who want to protect themselves, so there's money in it, right?
I'm sure that's true, but actually, having said that, I think it's kind of an idealistic point of view that this would get into the culture, and it would take probably lots and lots of horrible things to happen before people started to really consider that seriously.
That's true.
And that the incentives really are going in the opposite direction.
Which means we've got to get government involved, in other words.
I think government should have a role.
Okay, real quick.
Well, and I would just respond to that. It's very trivial for a government to outlaw what you're talking about and make it illegal for people to do that sort of thing and enforce it.
In the U.S.
But then again, theoretically, people control the government, but maybe not. No, we got so many hands, we've got very little time. She had her hand up, and I do want to hear from Dent.
Yeah, try to be very quick. Rachel from UNESCO, and thank you for the panel. We're having some discussions on these issues, and I found it incredibly useful and enlightening. I wondered in the definition of legal autonomous weapon systems, if now that other devices or other systems are being used as weapons, for example, in France where I live, there have been many cases of cars crashing into crowds, or in Toronto. Do you think that these sort of bans should apply to other devices, or is the response through greater security measures, and kind of where do you draw the line of what's considered a weapon and what should be banned?
That's for Todd, then real fast, please, because we were very little.
Yeah, so I drew the distinction earlier between capabilities and technologies. I think that definition can be applied to any instantiation of technology. To ask, for example, could this car autonomously decide to and carry out a killing of people? And so it's pretty easy, actually, to apply it, in my opinion.
Okay, Daniel.
Yeah, my name is Daniel Stauffacher from ICT4Peace Foundation, and together with Barbara Weeks, we are happy to have organized this important event. And,
they did the work.
That was not my point.
I appreciate it, because I think you did a good job gathering this group.
As Rinaldi, know, my background is diplomacy, and I was involved in organizing the World Summit on Information Society. Many of you don't remember, maybe, but that was kind of a meeting that could address these questions. Now, particularly
15 years ago. Right?
15 years ago, yeah. And I think we're still, benefiting from that common vision that was produced at that time. But with regard to this discussion here and the way we phrased it, AI, lethal autonomous weapons, and peacetime threats, basically, and that's also in the paper of Regina Sorber, which you can find on our website on the post of today, is really that we need a more comprehensive look at, because all of these 4 areas, if I may roughly say, AI and ethics, mass surveillance, lethal autonomous weapons, cybersecurity, and AI possibly, are concerned with human security. I mean, the point is we have to make ourselves safe and secure in this cyberspace. And with this was fortunately not yet the case. So I think what we try to do, and as a policymaker, diplomat, former, when we go towards a global discussion, and there will be, and we have to educate policymakers on these very complex issues and its social ramification, is that we find a common place which combines all these, and that's the difficulty. I mean, yours is maybe UNESCO is discussing it. Yours, it's the 3rd committee in the UN, mass surveillance. Yours is in Geneva, CC, and UGGE in the 1st committee, and it's all separate all over the place. So where we maybe approach it is to get a common denominator, and that could be the human security, or the digital human security, a concept, human security, which was discussed many years ago, but maybe we could revive that and take it as the center point. In each case, what does it mean for my security? Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Really interesting thought to close on, and I think we do have to close, right? Definitely. Sorry, we went a little over, but it was pretty darn good. Thank you again to Daniel and Barbara for organizing it. I hope this discussion will continue, because obviously it's pretty urgent. So thank you all for being here.
It's a pleasure.